Just to confirm, it's streaming. I hope you're on mute, Chair. Sorry.
Thank you. That helps. It's yes, welcome to the Housing Committee. It's Wednesday, the 2nd of November, and it is 6:30, so we will start the meeting. And the first item on the agenda is questions from the public and members of the council. We've been notified of 3 questions from members of the public who aren't able to attend this evening. So I will start by reading them out. And some of them are quite long. So the first one is from Mike Hayden, and he says, I understand that there are currently hundreds of children included in the households accommodated by Bedford Borough Council in temporary accommodation at the moment. I'm sure everyone agrees that this is not good for them. How does the council consider location of temporary accommodation in relation to children's schooling and support networks? And is there anything else that can be done to minimise the disruption and distress that arises from living in temporary accommodation? So thank you, Mike, for that question, and it's a very good question. And naturally, we wouldn't like any child to be living in temporary accommodation, but unfortunately that does happen. And a lot is done to avoid it. So I do know that officers work extremely hard to find every way possible to ensure that the temporary accommodation that they are in is of good standard. And indeed, the council, we've been investing in buying up properties that for temporary accommodation, and some of these are specifically able to accommodate families. And indeed, I've been to some of the new properties that we have purchased in St. Peter's Street and also in Tavistock Street, where we've got a new block of flats which will be starting to be used very shortly, and they've got accommodation in them that take families, and with a good number of bedrooms as well. So I wonder though if Lee wants to add to that.
Thank you, Colleen. And of course, I do agree as well that it's not at all good for children to be in temporary accommodation, and we do as much as possible to prevent that. When we do get to the point of offering temporary accommodation to a family, the team will give as much consideration as possible to the location, taking into account the family's needs, particularly location to schools. But there is a high demand for accommodation from homeless families at the moment, and in reality, it's not always possible to find accommodation that's in the same area of the borough that they've been living in. But if people are required to move away from the children's schools, the homelessness team will then liaise with the council schools transport team to establish what can be done in terms of assisting the family with getting the children to school and minimising any disruption to their education. And they will also contact Children's Services if there are any other concerns about the impact of homelessness on the children's well-being.
Okay, thank you for that, Lee. And once again, Mike, yeah, it's something that we would like to avoid, but sometimes it does happen. And but the accommodation we've been really trying hard to get and have purchased, especially those ones which are very suitable for family accommodation. So, okay, the next question then is from Shannon Johnson. And it reads, the report for the meeting agenda assumes that those with medical needs have a disability, although disability is not recorded specifically. Could the council specifically ask people during the application process whether they have a disability, and if so, what reasonable adjustments to the service are needed? not just in terms of the characteristic of the home they move into, but also the terms of the disabilities that would affect someone's ability to go through the application process itself. For example, a learning difficulty, to ensure that everyone's needs are identified and responded to appropriately. So again, Lee, are you able to answer that, please?
Certainly, Colleen. So the online application form is part of an ICT system that's provided by an external supplier that we use to, first of all, enable people to make the application and then to be able to assess their eligibility. And we would need to check with the supplier whether they could offer this type of functionality. At the moment, there is an option for people to tick to say that they have a disability, but it's not a compulsory field, and therefore the information we've got we don't feel is reliable enough to report on. So we will ask that question of the supplier. But it's a very good suggestion, and one thing that we can do quite easily is to actually include a message on the letter that we send out whenever somebody submits their initial application, which explains what they need to provide to support the application. And basically, we'll put a sentence on the start of the letter to ask them to let us know if they need any help with the application process due to a disability. And we will be able to do that very quickly.
Okay, thank you, Lee. And I hope that answers Shannon's question and that she's pleased with the response. So the last one then is a long one to read out. It's from Katie Welborn, and it says, "It's really good that the council is exploring waiting times for those with medical needs in detail, and whilst the report is really helpful, it doesn't say how many people in total are in each category of bedrooms required in relation to the table 5.10. Further details are on table 5.12, but this doesn't give a breakdown of those without a medical need. It's therefore not possible for the statistics to get an overall average for the number of additional days that people with medical needs have to wait compared to those without medical needs. Using weighted averages would suggest that people who have waited 57 days more than those without medical needs, but this isn't precise. The report also doesn't say whether it takes longer for people with medical needs to become active on the register due to having to provide additional evidence for those medical needs. So potentially people would have an additional delay to be accepted onto the register in the first place. Would it be possible for the council to provide figures for how many of the 1,658 households are in each bedroom category and indicate how much longer it takes from the first point of contact to the point of going live on the register for those with and without medical needs? I hope I've read that okay. As I said, it was quite long and very detailed, and I doubt whether Lee could just answer that straight away. So could I ask that you provide Katie with a written response, Lee, please?
Yes, certainly. I would need to go away and investigate the reporting functionality around those particular points. I wouldn't be able to give an answer here and now, but certainly we could provide a written response.
Okay, thank you very much. And that concludes the members of the public's questions. Are there any from the members of the council? No. Okay, in which case then I will move on to item number 2, which is to receive apologies for absence. Have we any apologies? Is anybody absent?
Yes, can I give Councillor Crofts apologies? He's away on council business.
Yeah. Thank you. Item number 3 then is minutes of the last meeting, which was held on the 7th of September. Are we agreed? Agreed, thank you. Item number 4 is a disclosure of local and/or disclosable pecuniary interests. Members are reminded that where they have a local and or disclosable pecuniary interest in any business of the council to be considered at this meeting, they must disclose the existence and nature of the interest at the commencement of that consideration, or when the interest becomes apparent in accordance with the council's code of conduct. Do we have any declarations? No. Okay, thank you. In which case then we'll move on to item number 5, which is the housing register waiting times, to which some of the questions referred to. So Lee, if you'd like to respond to this and make a start.
Okay, thank you, Colleen. So this report was in response to a request from the committee to investigate whether there are differences in waiting times for social housing between people with disabilities and those without disabilities. The information provided is comparing people who are eligible to go onto the housing register because of medical grounds. And the reason for that is with the data we've got, it's not we can't easily separate out people with disabilities and people who have other medical needs. In many cases, the medical need will be a disability. For example, we do regularly have people that need somewhere with level access because they have difficulty managing stairs and things like that. So the other important thing to know that the committee will be aware of is because of the way that the allocation scheme works, it's a choice-based scheme and it allows people applying for housing to choose when they want to bid for properties. So effectively they can choose just to bid on properties in a particular area and to wait in their accommodation they're at the moment. So the figures that we get, they don't give a measure of the absolute time that it's necessary for somebody to wait to be rehoused. The time includes that element of personal choice. If we sort of look at the chart at 5.10, this was just showing the comparison for 1, 2, 3 and then 4-bedroom or more properties and the average amount of time that somebody waited once they've been accepted onto the housing register. And that does show that for the 1, 2 and 3-bedroom properties, people do wait a little longer if they have a medical need. For the people requiring 4-bedroom properties or larger, it was slightly less, and that is likely to be to do with the level of priority that they get. So if people have a medical need and another housing need, for example, they're overcrowded, then they will have a higher priority than somebody that is just overcrowded. So that potentially explains that situation. And just at 5.12, just made the point of the just under 1,700 households that are currently active on the housing register. There's 412 people that have a medical need, but there is quite a high proportion of those that aren't actively bidding for properties at the moment. And we do periodically contact people that haven't been bidding for a period of time to check if they want to remain on the housing register or not. We haven't actually done that recently, particularly during the pandemic. It's a piece of housekeeping activity we need to pick up. But clearly that does demonstrate that people may be very choosy and waiting for the right property to come along. I'm happy to answer any questions that the committee may have.
Thank you, Lee. Any questions? I'm not sure that I can see anybody indicating. If I've missed you and you want to speak, please do so.
Ossie is waving furiously at you.
All right. Okay, no, I can't see her. Thank you.
Lee, what is I know that we said, look, it takes longer time, but do you have like people are speaking to me and talking to me, or we waiting, are we actively bidding for 3 years, 4 years? And is there any particular time, like 1 year, if somebody is like waiting for 1 year or 2 year or 3 year, they got priority because they've been on waiting on housing register for longer because a couple of residents, they were saying that we are in the housing register for 3 years or 4 years, and we have been success, and we are actually bidding, and the person next door is start the bidding after her. They have less children, they have good situation. It could be different. I didn't ask much detail, but they get the house quicker than us, so I don't know what's happening. So complain like this. There's any, time scales,
Um, So how the scheme works is that first of all, people are given a priority band. So we have a band D for emergencies, which people wouldn't be allocated that very often. That's really when somebody absolutely needs to move almost immediately for some reason. So generally the highest priority band would be A, and there's A, B, C, and D. So when somebody applies, we would look at all their circumstances, and based on the criteria in the allocation scheme, that determines which band they go into. If two people in the same band both bid for the property, then priority is given to the person that's been on the housing register waiting the longest. So it is possible that, for example, so if somebody was in band B and had been in that band for a couple of years, their neighbour has applied more recently but is in band A, if they both bid for the same property, then it does mean that the neighbour in band A is going to get priority. And in terms of the housing need, I was just explaining, if there's more than one housing need, then that gives somebody a higher priority. So the example being, if somebody is just overcrowded, so they're lacking a bedroom, they would go into band C. If they meet another criteria as well, so there is some kind of medical need that means the current property isn't suitable for medical reasons, and because they've got two priorities, that would move them up into band B. So there isn't a set period of time, and then add on to that how frequently people are bidding, which area they're bidding on, what size property they need. It's not possible to say that somebody should be waiting no more than X amount of time before they get rehoused, unfortunately.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Has anybody else got a question? Any comments? No? Okay, well, thank you, Lee. We've been asked to note that information that you've provided. Is everybody okay with that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Moving on then to the next item, which is item number 6, which is temporary accommodation. And again, Lee.
Well, thank you, Colleen. So the committee had requested a report providing some information on the pressures on accommodation, around temporary accommodation, and how that might compare to other similar authorities, and also the financial impact. It's quite a complex area, and I've tried in the report to provide as much information as possible. We've done some comparisons using the SIP for nearest neighbour local authorities that I suspect that members of the committee are familiar with from other reports and other areas. So we have also included in there Luton as being a geographical neighbour. Central Beds and Milton Keynes are already in the statistical neighbours. And what I've done, it's probably easiest to see on the chart. So on page 7, there's a chart showing the number of households in temporary accommodation in each of the comparator authorities. So just to explain that the government collects data from all housing authorities and publishes it on a quarterly basis. So this was the information as at 31st of March, which shows the temporary accommodation numbers. As you can see there, the borough at that point was quite high in comparison to some of the other authorities, but it does seem to be the authorities in the east and sort of southeast region at the highest, with Luton and Milton Keynes sort of considerably higher than everybody else. In terms of what the factors are here, there could be a variety of reasons. Property prices in comparison to income and how affordable they are could well be a factor. Whether the local authority has its own housing stock, which perhaps gives more options and more control over the actual accommodation. Although having said that, it is worth noting that Luton does have its own housing stock, but it does have significant people in temporary accommodation as well. So there is no one obvious factor that could pinpoint that. At 510, I did also look at a comparison to regions and the country as a whole across England. So unsurprisingly, London is particularly unusual compared to other authorities, but what it does show is that in Bedford we are in a sort of almost double the East of England average when you look at the temporary accommodation compared to the number of households. I've also at 515 on page 10 also looked at comparison, because the data that the government published shows the composition of the households. So I thought it'd be interesting to look at the proportion of single households, which would tend to be people with more complex needs compared to families. And interestingly, Bedford is quite high, and the committee will know from previous reports that we have seen a lot of single homelessness throughout the pandemic and on an ongoing basis. But there are also a number of other authorities that have got similar levels of single homelessness. So again, there's no one obvious picture around that. At 517, I put a chart in which is just comparing single homelessness and the number of people reported on the annual rough sleep account to see if there's any correlation there. Again, it's not that there's no very obvious correlation. I think one point I'd make in terms of the council's continued and everyone in approach to try to avoid not providing temporary accommodation wherever possible. And in terms of, I would expect that the authorities that are showing relatively high number of rough sleepers are those authorities that haven't maintained the everyone in approach. I just perhaps to touch on where we are with everyone in. So the figures in the report refer to people that are in, for want of a better word, mainstream temporary accommodation. So it doesn't include people that are accommodated because they would be rough sleeping. And we still have 34 people at the Mercure Hotel at the moment that aren't included in these figures. So the people that go into mainstream accommodation are those people that when they contact us as being homeless, we do an assessment, and based on that assessment, they've got a statutory entitlement to temporary accommodation. So they will be classed as in priority need of accommodation, which means they either have children, are vulnerable in some respect, or have one of the automatic eligibility criteria. So, for example, they're homeless due to domestic abuse. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to continue to have a statutory right to temporary accommodation indefinitely. So some people, all those people will qualify for 56 days during a relief period. After the 56 days, in some circumstances, the council could choose to end the accommodation duty. And similarly, there will be situations where people seriously breach the terms of the license to occupy the property. So, very serious antisocial behaviour, crime and things like that, where again, it would be reasonable for the council to end the accommodation. At the moment, throughout the pandemic and on an ongoing basis, we are doing our utmost to avoid having to end accommodation for people. There are unfortunately occasions where behaviour is that extreme that's not possible because accommodation providers won't accept them. But generally, we are maintaining that. In terms of the impact on budgets, I've just explained from sort of 518 onwards how that works, and I know that has been covered in previous reports, but we're entitled to charge a rent for temporary accommodation. The vast majority of people tend to be entitled to support through benefits, and with temporary accommodation it's housing benefit, so we recover housing benefit to cover the rent. However, for most of the property that we're renting in, there is a significant difference between the amount we have to pay for the accommodation and the amount of rent that we can recover, which creates a budget pressure for the council. It is an area of concern, and there is a lot of activity going on at the moment to try to reduce the both the number of people in temporary accommodation, which is obviously a good thing to do anyway, but also to try and bring down that financial cost. And that activity is focusing on improving prevention. So trying to make sure that we, where people contact us and they're not yet homeless, that we put resources into place to make sure that those people can be seen immediately by an officer. They will normally get an appointment. It could be the same day or at most within 5 days if they're not at immediate risk of homelessness. And the officers will then go through the personal housing plan. They will look at what action they may be able to take to prevent homelessness. So it may be contacting the landlord and negotiating on the person's behalf, looking at what other housing options they have. And the other area of activity that we're focusing on is the move on. So where people are in temporary accommodation, to focus on trying to make sure that we can source accommodation for those people, whether that's through the housing register. In many cases, it's supported housing because people do need some support to maintain the tenancies, and private sector. Although, again, as a committee, will be aware from previous reports, the private sector is very challenging because of the cost compared to levels of income and the amount of universal credit that somebody can get to assist them with the cost of renting. The other key thing that we're doing is the purchasing temporary accommodation. So the capital allocation is the target to deliver 120 properties in total, plus the units at Rogers Court. And at the moment, we have St Cuthbert Street, St Peter Street and Rogers Court are all occupied. And we've got 14 new units on Tavistock Street, which includes some family size accommodation that the property's been purchased, and our building services team are just doing some works at the moment. They're improving fire detection, equipment, etc., to make sure that the building's as safe as possible. And we expect to be able to move people in there very shortly. I don't know if anybody has any questions.
Any questions? Any comments?
Yes, I do.
Sorry, I can't see you. Yes, carry on.
I stuck my hand up, I think. Lee, I was surprised to see that we are still continuing maintaining the everyone in approach. I assume you mean in respect of those for whom we have no statutory duty. Is that correct?
That's correct, yeah.
How many of those how many of the 34 do we have no statutory duty in respect of? You mentioned 34 in the cure.
So that all 34, we wouldn't have a statutory duty to provide accommodation.
It's 34. How much? What's the cost per day per person?
The net cost for the rooms is, I think, about £68 per room. But then we would recover, I think the housing benefit element is about £15 per night.
So net cost of 50 in round numbers.
Approximately 50.
So that's about 20,000 per year per person.
And
which is about 600,000, which I calculate to be about 600,000 per year for the lot.
So some of that cost is offset.
Sorry, let me finish, please.
Oh, sorry, I apologise.
Is that correct? The cost in round numbers is around 600,000 a year for those for whom we have no statutory duty.
It would be around about that amount.
Can you say when that decision was taken, or can you tell me where that expenditure was authorised?
So the expenditure's been met from, there is a budget for the current year. Part of it is grant funded. So, for example, we've got funding through the RSI grant, etc.
How much of that goes to those for whom we have no statutory duty? So how much grant aiding goes to those for whom we have no statutory duty?
I couldn't give you the figures from the top of my head. I would need to go away and look at that.
So I know, of course, we have a budget for the overall area, but are you telling me that we have agreed a budget specifically with those for whom we have no statutory duty in mind?
There was a budget around the accommodation for people that would be at risk of rough sleeping. That's correct.
For which period?
But
But because we were getting a government grant for these people, quite reasonably, properly, because it was a legitimate thing at the time. Since the government grant is finished, have we taken a decision as to whether or not, at any level, as to whether or not this scheme should be continued?
Well, I say the accommodation is being funded through a specific budget that is in the approved budget. And in terms of the specifics with the grant, etc., I'd need to take that away and have a look at that. I couldn't give you that information so here and now.
And do you have any idea about how long these qualifying individuals have been in residence on this basis?
I mean, again, I haven't got the information in front of me. I do know that there is a regular turnover, so it's not a case of the same people have been in the hotel all the time. There has been a turnover of people on a regular basis.
So this is not just a question, if I can finish, this last question. So it's not just a question of continuing those for whom we already brought in under the scheme, which is sort of understandable. We're actually taking in new people for whom there is no statutory duty.
So yeah, where people would be at risk of rough sleeping.
But for whom we have no statutory duty.
That's correct.
I have a comment, Chair.
Okay, just any other questions? Okay, Stephen, your comment.
Just given Lee has agreed that the net cost in round numbers is around 600,000. That's my quick arithmetic. That seems to me to be a lot of money for those for whom we have no statutory duty, given we do have statutory duties, and we are, not to put it more strongly, not in a strong position financially. It seems to me this is a matter that should have been given some consideration and should have been subject to a decision. As I understand it, there has been no specific decision in this respect, which seems to me to be a gap.
I'm not convinced that that's what Lee said, because he did say we had some grant funding, so your net budget, but Councillor Headley may have some more detail.
Okay, Michael.
Thanks. Yeah. So yeah, I did have my hand up. I think what we need to really remember the context of this. First of all, and it's referenced in this report, we had some of the highest levels of rough sleeping in the country. We need to remember where we started with this. This is people who've got no roof over their heads, who are sleeping on the streets or in makeshift tents or whatever out and about, and through the summer, winter, all seasons. That's the situation we were in. That's the situation we were in before. People were sleeping in far too high numbers on the streets, and I don't want to return to that. I don't want those people who have got nowhere else to go, no recourse to any other support or accommodation, to basically go, right, you're back on the streets. That's what we're providing this service for. And it's we might have a statutory duty, but there's other things to consider beyond what is a legal necessity. And I think it's important. It's a really fundamental part of shelter, is a fundamental need for people. And I think now I don't disagree that we need to continue to review the situation, review the best accommodation. I know there's other, we're purchasing other accommodation. We've got purchased Rogers Court, it's a very successful accommodation. We need to continue to do work like that to make sure we've got the best and most cost-effective provision for people. But on the fundamental point, I do not want to return to the position where Bedford was one of the highest levels of people sleeping rough on the streets. That is not where I want to be.
Chair, I have my hand up before.
Yeah, I can see that now.
Thank you. So I absolutely agree with that, and I think we need to get the written answer from Lee to see the financial situation, because there are some grants, I believe. The stuff this flags up to me, and it's some work that I've been doing in the early stage, the chief executive, is how we do not get the 30% affordable houses that we need through the planning system and through this the government's change in the viability. And we must track all that, because if you look at how much we've got just in the low 20s percent, and you look at 10% difference, so 130 houses a year, if we had that, and I believe the numbers in temporary accommodation are higher than this now, if we had that over the last 6 or 7 years, that extra 130 houses, we would have those affordable houses. We could put people from temporary into permanent accommodation, permanent settle, which is what we want around all this screen. And we can actually move people away from having to actually be in hotel rooms, be nightly lets that looked at in hotels, or moving people into temporary accommodation where they're not sure where they're going to be, they're not sure where their children are going to go to school. And so to longer term, we need to tackle this temporary accommodation. So the affordable houses and what we get. You know, we've done a needs assessment that says we need 30%. You know, and when planning committee has to decide between whether it's electric charging points or affordable houses, or whether it's building houses or not building, we get 4%, as there was one in planning committee. That's not acceptable. We need 30% across the board, and we need to look at how others get that. And we need to actually be robust to making sure that developers deliver the 30% affordable that we have proved we need by doing that assessment. And we need the government to support us in doing that. We're the fastest growing authority in the fastest growing region. Not something we choose to do, but something the government said we need to do. And we're delivering what the government said. But we must deliver that 30% affordable. And that would actually remove over a period of time these issues we have with people in temporary accommodation, people in hotels. So I do think this committee should recommend that the executive looks at this and write a robust letter to the new Secretary of State to saying, would he support us in delivering affordable homes for the people that so need it, rather than bottlenecking people. So there's two bits of temporary accommodation. One is the people go in, that continues to rise. There's no exit route. And if you've actually talked to anybody and then trying to get accommodation at the moment, trying to rent accommodation, they are going so quickly, people are renting before they see them because they don't get to see it. If you don't do that, you don't get accommodation. So hopefully we'll look at that and look at how we can actually deliver the 30% affordable houses we so desperately need for our residents here in the borough. Thank you, Chair.
Sorry, Steve. Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you.
I don't disagree with a word of what the Mayor says, as he well knows. I'm entirely with him on those issues, and we're happy to join him, make sure that our side signs the same letter or sends a copy of the same letter. And so I personally signed it. But can I draw your attention, or the committee's attention, to the second paragraph on page 4 of the paper? An overly generous approach to providing accommodation can increase demand by attracting people to the borough because they believe they are more likely to be provided with accommodation. The issue is not about overall accommodation, the overall temporary accommodation. I agree entirely with what the Mayor says. It doesn't touch on this particular point. Of course, we will be better able to cope with those for whom we have a duty if we are not equally at the same time trying to cope with those for whom we do not have a duty. That is my basic point.
Lee, I believe you want to come in.
No, apologies, Chair, no.
Oh, no.
Unless
Okay.
there was a specific question.
Okay, no, right, Dave. You're on mute.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you, Councillor Moon, for his comments. We do have to look at what the consequence of what he's suggesting is about the 78 people we had rough sleeping in the borough. But I was going to make some more general comments about the report and the numbers. So it does look, I haven't done the correlation, but it does look as if there's a correlation between where we are and where your proximity to London and access to London. The further away you are, there seems to be less you have with the less access. And that may be the knock-on effect, and the figures we can see at the 14%, I think it is, that's happening in London. So that's something to consider. We also have local authorities, and we know that, for example, I believe Luton has got over 100. They're saying they're going to rent or purchase properties in Bedford to actually put some of their people in temporary accommodation. We know that other local authorities, pushing London authorities particularly, are pushing out. And I think we do need to have agreed across the whole of the local authorities about this shunting of people away. If a local authority puts some people here for 3 years, they then become our residents, and we have to deal and cope and support them moving forward into be that. So into being having a settled accommodation. So I think it's a much bigger problem. And Councillor Moon and I have talked about this, and I think we agree that the housing market needs some serious fixing. It's not in the right place, and he's nodding, so I'm not putting words in his mouth. So thank you, Councillor Moon. And I think just looking at some of the fringes, it needs an overall address and a proper one. Just saying we need 300,000 houses doesn't actually give a solution to this. We need 300,000 houses. We need the right types of houses in the right types of places. And that's not all in Bedford Borough, but we do need a high proportion of social and affordable houses so that we can support that. Thank you, Lee, for the report. I think it leaves lots of information we can use. And there is a really clustering around the towns, Luton, Milton Keynes, ourselves. I think the other thing it highlights is its large towns. So Medway's close proximity to London, or closer proximity, but of course Medway is 5 smaller towns. So it does seem to be larger towns attract people. Though of course we do have to have a local connection. We need to check that what we do. The information I've seen, Lee, does say we actually check for local connection in terms of that. But we need to be that. Maybe some authorities are much tougher with their local connection to support them. I don't know if that's something you know, Lee, or something we could investigate.
So in terms of the statutory approaches, then if somebody has that statutory entitlement, they can approach any local authority at the moment. However, we will encourage them to apply to an area they've got a connection with, unless there's some real reason why they can't do that. Also, in terms of people that are approaching that are rough sleeping, again, the team are quite thorough. They will, try to establish the person's circumstances. I mean, I am aware of at least one person in the last 2 or 3 weeks that arrived because they'd been advised by a charitable organisation in London that if you went to Bedford, you might be able to get accommodation there. That particular person, we did encourage them to return to London and assisted them to get back there. So the team are not just accepting anybody at face value, and also there is a verification process. So before we will accept somebody, we make sure that they are rough sleeping, particularly if it's somebody that's not already known to the service and isn't from the local area. So we try to make sure that it isn't easy to get that accommodation, because the team are conscious of the cost.
Chair, can I just ask if I have a conversation with Lee outside the meeting about which charities, because we probably need to talk to them. It is totally unfair in Bedford Borough.
Okay. Mr. Mayor, I'm not sure if we know which charity it was, but
if we can find out, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah, because it's certainly not helping us at all when we've got such a large number requiring temporary accommodation because of rough sleeping. Any more comments? No. I mean, it is particularly noticeable, as Lee has said, that on table 5.8, the differences and between those that are closer to London than those that are further away. I mean, just looking at North Somerset, it's 0.08%, and yet Milton Keynes is 0.8%, which is a big difference. And then, of course, we're on 0.52. So we've got a big problem on our hands that we are trying our very best to resolve. So thank you, Lee. Before I finish, any more comments? No? Okay, and we're asked to note this report as well, and thank Lee for the amount of information that is within it. So, thank you. Are we happy with the report? We got a thumbs up there.
Agreed.
Thank you. Okay, looking then at the final item, which is the work programme. Which I can't open. Are we happy with the work programme? Yep. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you. In which case then that's the end of the meeting, and thank you everybody for attending.
Thank you.
And thank you, Lee, because both those reports were yours and a lot of work went into it.
Thanks very much, Lee.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you.